She doesn't work here. And she's with another man.
Ethan's heart pounded as he pushed through the revolving doors of the sleek office building, clutching the small box of chocolates he had bought for his wife. He had no idea that today, a simple gesture of love would unravel everything he thought he knew about his marriage. The lobby gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, but instead of warmth, it felt cold, an icy prelude to the shock waiting for him. The receptionist's polite smile froze on her face as she shook her head. She doesn't work here, and she's with another man, she said, each word slicing through him like glass. Ethan staggered back, a jumble of disbelief, anger, and disbelief flooding his chest. The world spun. Memories of laughter, shared secrets, and quiet nights at home now felt like a cruel joke. Something deep and terrifying had been hidden from him, and he had just glimpsed the first edge of a secret that could destroy everything. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment below with your city and local time. Let's see where everyone's watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more shocking, emotional stories. Ethan stood frozen in the lobby, the receptionist's words echoing in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. She doesn't work here. She's with another man. The sentences repeated over and over, twisting and turning inside him, each repetition heavier than the last. His hands trembled, gripping the small box of chocolates so tightly that the paper wrapper crumpled beneath his fingers. He had imagined so many scenarios for this day, surprising her with lunch, leaving a note of love on her desk, catching her smile as she glanced up, but none of them had ever included this. None had prepared him for the cold, shattering disbelief of discovering that the woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with might be leading another life entirely. The lobby seemed impossibly large and impersonal now, its gleaming floors reflecting his chaotic thoughts. He looked around desperately, as if searching for some hidden truth that might undo the receptionist's claim. Maybe it was a mistake. Perhaps she had simply changed offices without telling him. But the subtle panic curling in his chest told him that this wasn't a simple oversight. Something was very wrong, and the calm professionalism of the receptionist only heightened the surreal terror of the moment. Her neatly folded hands, the polite tilt of her head, but the way she didn't flinch under his intense gaze, it all screamed honesty. And that honesty, cruel as it was, pierced Ethan more deeply than any lie ever could. He stepped back, trying to collect himself, fumbling for his phone. His fingers dialed her number automatically, without thought, driven by a mixture of hope and dread. The first ring seemed to stretch on forever, a cruel echo of anticipation that only deepened his unease. Then the voicemail clicked in, cold and impersonal, denying him the answers he so desperately needed. He tried again, and again. No answer. Each attempt was like a hammer blow to his chest. Each failure, a reminder that the truth he feared might be undeniable. The realization gnawed at him. She could be deliberately avoiding him, orchestrating this behind his back, living a secret life that he had never glimpsed. As he leaned against the polished marble counter, Ethan's mind began to trace the last few weeks in painstaking detail. The small inconsistencies he had dismissed at the time now glared at him like neon signs. Late nights at work, vague excuses, unexplained texts, hurried phone calls that ended when he approached suddenly. Every tiny moment seemed loaded with hidden meaning. His mind spun, trying to reconcile the loving woman he knew with the possibility that she had been living a lie. The sense of betrayal was so sharp that it left him momentarily breathless, as if the very air had been stolen from his lungs. Each memory, each laughter-filled evening, each whispered, "I love you," now felt tainted, a sinister prelude to the revelation in the lobby. He tried to speak to the receptionist again, asking for any hint, any shred of evidence, any clue that might offer him an explanation, but she only shook her head again, her expression firm yet apologetic. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I just don't know anything else. She's not employed here, and I really saw her with another man." That certainty in her tone left Ethan reeling. He could feel his hands starting to sweat, his throat tightening as his pulse raced. The world outside the building, normally bustling and comforting, seemed distant, irrelevant, as if it belonged to someone else. He was trapped in a moment that had no easy answers, caught in the violent juxtaposition of normal life and the chaos his mind refused to control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stepped out into the street. The city was alive, oblivious to the storm consuming him. People passed, chatting, laughing, focused on their own lives, while he staggered through the crowd, a man undone by a single, devastating truth. He had never felt more isolated. The sense of injustice burned within him, a raw and unrelenting ache that mixed grief with fury. How could she betray him? How could the life they had shared, the trust they had built, unravel so completely in one instant? He wanted answers. He wanted confrontation. He wanted to tear through the lies and find some clarity, some vindication. But mostly, he wanted to understand why the woman he loved could betray him so effortlessly. Ethan wandered the streets aimlessly, retracing the routes she usually took to work, searching for anything that might explain the unexplainable. Coffee shops, gyms, small boutiques, and office buildings, he checked, each with a growing sense of dread, hoping for some miraculous miscommunication, some sign that what he had heard was not real. But everywhere he went, the answers were the same. No one had seen her. No one knew where she was. Each negative response tightened the knot in his chest, confirming that this was not a mistake. Someone had deliberately hidden the truth from him, and he had stumbled into it at the worst possible moment. The day stretched on, long and merciless. Shadows lengthened across the pavements as Ethan's desperation grew. He noticed the subtle glances of strangers, the way people seemed to look away when he made eye contact. Was someone following him? Was he being watched? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, adding another layer of tension to an already unbearable situation. Every unanswered phone call, every lack of explanation, every fleeting shadow seemed to whisper the same chilling message. Something sinister had begun, and he was only now realizing the scope of what he faced. By late afternoon, Ethan sank onto a park bench, exhausted but unable to stop thinking. His mind raced through possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Could she have been planning this for months? Did the man she was with have sinister motives? Was this a simple act of betrayal, or part of a larger, more calculated deception? The questions piled up, each one a weight pressing down on his chest. He realized that he could no longer ignore the signs, could no longer cling to hope as a protective shield. He had to face reality. However painful, however shattering, for the first time, he felt the raw edge of fear slice through his shock. He had loved deeply, trusted blindly, and in a single moment, that trust had been ripped away. Ethan knew that whatever came next, whatever confrontation, investigation, or revelation awaited him, he would face it alone. And yet, beneath the fear and betrayal, a spark of determination flickered. He refused to be a passive victim. He would uncover the truth, no matter how painful, and he would confront it with courage. Somewhere in the chaos of that day, the first step of a long, harrowing journey had begun, a journey that would test every ounce of his resilience, intelligence, and heart. Ethan couldn't shake the image of the receptionist's words from his mind. "She doesn't work here. She's with another man." The words reverberated in his thoughts like a sinister echo, each repetition stripping away the comfort of everything he had believed about his marriage. Standing outside the office building, he felt the city around him blur into insignificance, the noise and chaos reduced to a dull hum behind the storm raging in his chest. He knew he had to find her, had to understand what was happening, but the thought of the truth terrified him. What if the receptionist had been right? What if this was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but a calculated betrayal? Ethan began retracing her usual routines, moving from one familiar place to another with a growing sense of urgency. He visited the coffee shop where she always ordered her morning latte, only to be met with polite confusion from the barista. "I haven't seen her this week. the young man said. Glancing at him curiously, Ethan's stomach churned as he nodded, thanked him, and walked out into the brisk air. The café, once a place of warmth and simple joy, now felt like an empty stage, a hollow shell echoing the absence of someone he thought he knew. He moved on to the small gym she frequented, the place where she always insisted on starting her day with a quick workout. Staff members shook their heads apologetically. No one had seen her. Each negative answer was a hammer blow, each explanation, or lack thereof, deepening his growing dread. The more he searched, the more the city transformed around him. Streets that had always been familiar now seemed strange, almost hostile, as if conspiring against him. Faces of strangers blurred together, their indifferent expressions a stark contrast to the personal chaos consuming him. Ethan began to notice subtle details he had ignored before. A shadow moving too quickly along a wall, a car parked for too long near a corner, the sudden hush of pedestrians as he passed. It was as though the city itself had become a character in this unfolding mystery, holding secrets he was desperate to uncover but unable to access. Fear prickled at the back of his neck. Was he being watched? Was someone aware that he had begun piecing together fragments of a truth that had been deliberately hidden by the afternoon? His search led him to the grocery store she visited every Thursday. He walked up and down the aisles, scanning for familiar faces, hoping to catch sight of her or anyone who might know her whereabouts. He approached the checkout clerks, asking casually at first, then with growing desperation as he realized the futility of polite questioning. Each shake of a head, each shrug, each repetition of, "I haven't seen her," drove him further into panic. The thought that she could be deliberately hiding from him, actively avoiding his presence, gnawed at him. He tried to recall if he had noticed any recent behavior. Was she evasive on the phone, secretive with her messages, unusually distant? All the small, dismissed moments of the past weeks suddenly felt like glaring warnings he had failed to heed. Ethan paused outside the store, leaning against the cold brick wall as he tried to steady his shaking hands. His mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Could she have been planning this? Was the other man part of something more sinister? Someone who had somehow inserted himself into their lives with calculated precision? The thought of her laughing, smiling, sharing moments with someone else, while he remained unaware, filled him with a mixture of fury and heartbreak. The weight of betrayal pressed down on him so heavily that he felt it physically, an ache that coiled around his chest and tightened with every passing second. Desperation drove him to expand his search further. He visited other familiar locations, a boutique she had mentioned for a weekend shopping trip, the small park where they had often walked together after dinner, even a quiet library where she sometimes went to read in solitude. Everywhere he went, he encountered the same emptiness, the same polite confusion, the same absence that screamed of a truth he wasn't ready to face. Each moment without her presence chipped away at the illusions he had built around their life together. The realization that she might be living a secret life, orchestrating encounters and interactions behind his back, became harder to ignore. Each unanswered question seemed to multiply, spinning around in his head like a tornado of doubt and suspicion. By evening, Ethan found himself on a street he had never paid much attention to, a less traveled path that led to a row of older office buildings. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long, stretching shadows across the pavement, turning familiar shapes into strange, almost threatening silhouettes. His phone had gone dead hours ago, leaving him completely cut off from any potential support. The isolation was suffocating. He felt exposed, vulnerable, a single man against a vast, indifferent city. The idea of confronting her, finding answers, or even speaking to anyone who could help became both necessary and terrifying. The thought that the truth might be crueler than anything he had imagined gnawed at him, relentless and unyielding. In that moment of isolation, a small spark of determination flared inside him. If she was hiding, if there was indeed another man, he would uncover it. He refused to allow himself to be left in uncertainty, trapped by questions that would never be answered unless he acted. Every step forward was fraught with tension, every glance over his shoulder a potential threat. Yet the compulsion to discover the truth propelled him. Ethan knew that facing what awaited him would be painful, that heartbreak and betrayal lay ahead. But the need for clarity, for justice, for the restoration of his sense of reality, outweighed his fear. The day's journey, with its relentless questioning and futile searches, had only confirmed one thing. The story he had believed, in the life he had trusted, was no longer intact. As night fell, the city lights flickered on, casting a cold glow over empty streets and silent storefronts. Ethan's mind remained a storm of questions, anxiety, and desperate hope. Somewhere, hidden from view, the truth was waiting, and he was determined to find it, no matter how dark, twisted, or devastating it might be. Every unanswered call, every invisible shadow, every empty cafe or gym became a piece of the puzzle he was now resolved to solve. The night stretched before him, uncertain, dangerous, and full of the secrets he could no longer ignore. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, but it wasn't her. It was Marcus, his oldest and most trusted friend, calling with the instinctive timing that only true friends seem to possess. Ethan answered with a shaky voice, barely able to contain the panic bubbling under his skin. He explained, in rapid, fragmented sentences, what had happened at the office lobby, the receptionist's words, the shock, the unbearable uncertainty. Marcus listened patiently, the familiar calm in his tone, a small balm against the torrent of chaos Ethan felt inside. "All right," Marcus said finally. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this." The words should have been comforting, but Ethan could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing on him. He was about to step into a truth that might shatter everything he believed about his life. Together, they began to strategize, Marcus offering practical steps while Ethan's mind raced through every terrifying possibility. Social media accounts, shared emails, phone logs. Marcus suggested tracing her digital footprint. Ethan's chest tightened at the thought of what he might discover, but he knew he had to see it for himself. The initial fear was now coupled with a sense of grim determination. He could no longer rely on hope, no longer cling to ignorance as a shield. The time for confronting reality had arrived. Whether he was ready or not, they started with the obvious, checking her online presence. Ethan sat in his dimly lit apartment, scrolling through old messages, hidden apps, and recently deleted content. Each click, each revelation added a layer of dread. There were gaps in activity, moments that didn't make sense, conversations that seemed oddly secretive. Ethan's fingers hovered over the screen, reluctant to dig further, knowing the deeper he went, the harder it would be to turn back. He found himself confronting not just the actions of another person, but the terrifying possibility that his own perception had been manipulated for months. Every detail he had dismissed as trivial now screamed betrayal. Marcus suggested they widen the search, starting with people she interacted with regularly. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances, anyone who might inadvertently reveal a clue. Ethan hesitated, feeling the invasive nature of it all. But the fear of remaining in ignorance outweighed the discomfort of investigation. They began sending discreet messages, making phone calls under the guise of casual conversation, probing for answers without revealing Ethan's growing sense of panic. The responses were mixed. Some gave vague, unhelpful replies. Others were oddly evasive, and a few seemed nervous or reluctant. The picture was beginning to take shape, but it was not yet complete, and the uncertainty gnawed at Ethan relentlessly. As the day wore on, the emotional weight of the search became almost unbearable. Every unanswered question, every vague or contradictory response, served only to heighten Ethan's anxiety. The betrayal he had glimpsed in the lobby was no longer a possibility. It was an increasingly likely reality. His thoughts oscillated between disbelief and bitter anger. How could someone he loved so deeply hide such fundamental truths? How could trust be so easily shattered? The emotional complexity of the situation weighed on him. The intertwining threads of love, hope, despair, and outrage, forming a tapestry that was painful to witness, even within the confines of his own mind. Marcus urged patience, reminding Ethan that confirmation was necessary before any confrontation. Ethan nodded. Though the compulsion to act immediately was nearly unbearable, they organized a plan: continued observation, careful questioning, and digital investigation. Each step was deliberate, measured, yet fraught with tension. Ethan's nerves were stretched taut, the fear of the unknown mixed with the grim anticipation of what he might discover. It was an emotional tightrope, and every moment felt like a test of his endurance, resilience, and moral compass. The investigation led them to subtle but telling discoveries. There were patterns in her online activity, moments where she was conspicuously absent, and interactions that suggested another presence in her life. Each revelation was a small jolt, a confirmation of Ethan's worst fears, yet simultaneously a necessary step toward clarity. The suspense built with each fragment of evidence, every subtle sign, drawing Ethan deeper into a labyrinth of emotional turmoil. He realized that he could no longer simply hope for explanations. He had to face the truth directly, confront it, and prepare for the confrontation's inevitable emotional consequences. By evening, Ethan felt the cumulative weight of the day pressing down on him. His apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt oppressive, filled with shadows and echoes of questions left unanswered. He wandered from room to room, checking his phone obsessively, scanning messages, re-examining each detail he had uncovered. Marcus's presence was a stabilizing force, yet Ethan knew the ultimate journey was his alone. The betrayal, the deception, and the emotional upheaval could not be shared. They had to be faced head-on. The clarity that came with observation and discovery was bitter, a mix of relief and dread. It was the first step in navigating the treacherous waters of a reality that had been hidden from him for far too long. Ethan's mind cycled endlessly through possible scenarios, imagining confrontations, explanations, and defenses. He visualized her responses, rehearsed his questions, and tried to anticipate the other man's reactions. The city outside darkened, streetlights flickering on, reflecting in the puddles from a recent rain. Each shadow seemed to mirror his inner turmoil. Every passing figure, a potential clue or threat. Time stretched, each hour heavy with anticipation, each minute a reminder that the answers he sought were still out of reach, obscured by deception and the careful construction of secrets. Yet, despite the fear, the heartbreak, and the exhaustion, a thread of resolve began to weave through his mind. He would uncover the truth, piece together the reality of her life outside his awareness, and confront it with the courage that had carried him through so many challenges before. The night loomed ahead, uncertain, dangerous, yet full of the potential for revelation, and Ethan was determined to meet it head-on. The following morning, Ethan awoke with a sense of both dread and grim determination. The events of the previous day clung to him like a shadow, refusing to be shaken off, and the weight of unanswered questions pressed relentlessly on his chest. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, replaying every moment: the receptionist's words, her absence, the phone calls that had gone unanswered, and tried to steel himself for what he needed to do next. He knew he couldn't linger in this limbo any longer. Denial had run its course. He had glimpsed the first edge of betrayal, and now he had to confront the mounting evidence that his life, as he knew it, was unraveling. Ethan's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the shared tablet he and his wife had once used to plan vacations, split bills, and exchange messages. He scrolled through their past conversations, initially searching for casual reminders of their everyday life, small moments that might reassure him, but instead, he found cracks he hadn't noticed before: deleted messages, odd gaps in timelines, notifications he had ignored, all now glaringly conspicuous. The pieces were there, scattered and disjointed, like a puzzle deliberately dismantled. With each revelation, a cold, hollow feeling spread through him. His mind raced, trying to connect the fragments into a coherent picture. yet every attempt only deepened his anxiety. He recalled the nights she had claimed to be working late, the sudden trips she had made without explanation, the vague excuses about meetings and errands that never quite added up. Each memory, once comforting, now felt sinister, a prelude to something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The thought that she could be living a double life, orchestrating interactions and narratives while keeping him in the dark, was unbearable. He felt both violated and helpless, trapped in a web, spun by someone he had trusted implicitly. Ethan's stomach churned with a mixture of rage, sorrow, and disbelief, emotions so raw that they made his chest ache with each breath. Marcus arrived mid-morning, carrying a calm that contrasted sharply with Ethan's frayed nerves. His presence was a stabilizing force, a reminder that he was not entirely alone in facing the nightmare that had unfolded. They sat together in Ethan's living room, laptops open, phones at the ready. As they began piecing together the subtle patterns she had left behind, Ethan's hands shook as he typed, his eyes darting across emails, social media notifications, and the digital breadcrumbs he had overlooked for so long. Each small discovery, an unfamiliar friend request, a cryptic comment, a photo subtly hinting at another presence in her life, was like a blow, confirming what he had feared but hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge. They decided to go beyond the digital trail, to start reaching out to people she might have interacted with recently. Friends, acquaintances, colleagues, anyone who might inadvertently reveal her whereabouts. Ethan's heart pounded with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Every message sent, every casual inquiry, was an exercise in tension. He was searching for confirmation, for the truth, but part of him feared the answers he might receive. What if her absence from his life was intentional? What if she had already moved on, entwined with someone else? The thought of discovering her with another man, of seeing proof of betrayal, sent a shiver of dread down his spine. Yet he knew he had to face it. Ignorance was no longer an option. Hours passed, each filled with anxious anticipation. Ethan's mind raced through potential confrontations, imagining dialogues that might unfold, rehearsing questions and responses. Marcus tried to maintain a sense of calm, reminding him to be methodical and patient. But Ethan felt the urgency gnawing at him relentlessly. The emotional stakes were higher than anything he had previously encountered. This wasn't simply about suspicion, it was about the foundation of his entire life. Each discovery, each piece of subtle evidence, was a step deeper into a reality that he had no choice but to confront. Finally, late in the afternoon, a lead emerged. A mutual acquaintance approached cautiously and subtly, revealed that she had been seen with a man at a café downtown, someone unfamiliar to Ethan, but described in detail enough to ignite a spark of recognition. His chest tightened as the pieces began to converge, each fact layering onto the next, forming a mosaic of betrayal. The reality he had feared was no longer abstract. It was concrete, present, and waiting. Ethan felt a complex storm of emotions, rage, heartbreak, disbelief, and an almost desperate need to understand why. His mind flashed back to shared dinners, laughter, quiet nights at home, all moments that now seemed tainted, shadows of a reality he could no longer trust. Determined, Ethan and Marcus planned a discreet visit to the cafe. They needed confirmation, an undeniable glimpse of the truth, but they also needed to prepare themselves for the impact. The drive through the city streets was tense. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles were white, each red light stretching the anticipation to unbearable lengths. He imagined 1,000 possible outcomes, each more devastating than the last, and yet he could not turn back. The need to face the truth outweighed his fear of it. He rehearsed questions in his mind, the confrontation that awaited him, forming in vivid detail, each imagined scenario sharpening his resolve. Upon arrival, the cafe appeared ordinary, warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Ethan. Through the window, he saw her. She was laughing, smiling, completely at ease, leaning into the man beside her. their familiarity unmistakable. Every detail, the way she tilted her head, the laughter that once had been reserved for him, was now shared with someone else. Ethan's breath caught, his heart hammering painfully in his chest. The betrayal was real, the reality of what he had feared, glimpsed in the cold words of a receptionist, was now undeniable. His mind raced, emotions colliding, violently hurt, anger, disbelief, and a desperate need for answers. The woman he had trusted with his life was here, and here was proof of everything he had begun to suspect. Marcus placed a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder, a silent reminder to remain composed. Ethan felt a surge of conflicting impulses, rage, the desire to confront, to shout, to demand an explanation, and yet an equally powerful need to process the moment, to ensure that any action he took was deliberate, controlled, and meaningful. The gravity of the situation, the deep injustice of the betrayal, had stripped away any pretense of normalcy. In that moment, Ethan realized that the journey ahead would demand not only courage, but strategic thinking, emotional fortitude, and the willingness to face the deepest wounds of his life without flinching. The café scene, illuminated by the soft afternoon light, seemed almost cinematic in its intensity. The people inside, oblivious to the storm behind the glass, moved through the space unaware. As Ethan's world tilted on its axis, every laugh, every casual gesture, every shared glance between her and the other man was a piercing confirmation of the truth he had long feared. Yet, beneath the shock, beneath the raw sting of betrayal, a steely resolve began to form. He would uncover the full story, piece together the hidden narrative of her double life, and confront it with the courage and clarity that had always defined him. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with emotional peril. But Ethan knew that facing the truth was the only way to reclaim his agency and begin the process of healing. Ethan parked a few blocks away from the cafe, his pulse hammering in his ears as he tried to steady his breathing. Every streetlight, every passerby, every honking car seemed magnified in his perception, each detail sharpened by the adrenaline coursing through him. He didn't want to be seen. Not yet, not until he knew for certain what was unfolding inside. He stayed in the car for a long moment, hands tight around the steering wheel, fighting the urge to rush in, to confront the truth immediately. But the methodical part of him, the part Marcus had always relied upon in tense situations, urged patience. Observation first, proof second, confrontation last. From his vantage point, Ethan could see her clearly now. She was seated at a small corner table, leaning slightly forward, her voice animated, laughter spilling freely. The man beside her mirrored her movements, leaning in, sharing in the intimacy of her gestures. The sight cut Ethan deeper than he had imagined possible. He remembered countless nights they had spent together, the same smiles, the same gestures, the shared warmth of quiet evenings, and now it all belonged to someone else. A wave of disbelief surged through him, but he forced himself to remain still, to watch, to gather the evidence he knew he would need to confront her. To understand the depth of the betrayal, every interaction between them seemed amplified. Every laugh, every subtle touch, a deliberate message that he had been excluded from this life. Ethan's stomach churned as he traced the familiarity between them, trying to pinpoint the moment when the distance between him and his wife had begun to grow. He recalled her recent excuses, the late nights, the vague stories about work, the moments when she seemed distracted or evasive. All the signs were there in retrospect, screaming at him now, each revelation cutting like glass. The calm of the afternoon cafe belied the storm inside him, the emotional earthquake that had been quietly building over weeks and months. Marcus, sitting silently beside him in the car, offered nothing but presence, a steadying force in the chaos of Ethan's mind. He understood that words would be futile, that Ethan needed space to process the confirmation of his worst fears. Ethan's jaw tightened as he leaned forward slightly, straining for every detail. The man was younger, with a smug confidence in his posture, the kind of presence that suggested calculated charm. There was an arrogance in the way he smiled at her, a subtle claim over the space that had once been exclusively Ethan's. The sight ignited a mix of anger and protective instinct within him, emotions so raw they threatened to overwhelm his reason. For what felt like hours, Ethan observed, cataloging every movement, every glance, every small interaction that suggested intimacy and secrecy. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on? What had he missed? Was it just emotional betrayal? Or had it crossed other boundaries? The answers were out of reach for now, hidden behind the polite faces and soft laughter inside the café. But he refused to let the uncertainty paralyze him. He had to witness, to understand, before he could act. The world outside the car moved obliviously, the city humming along its ordinary course. Pedestrians passed, cars zipped by, and street vendors called to passers-by. Yet Ethan felt isolated in a bubble of heightened awareness. Every laugh from the café pierced his chest, every shared joke between her and the man, a reminder of the intimacy he had been denied. He traced the familiar gestures, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head, the casual touch of her hand across the table, each nuance a dagger of proof. He had known her so well, thought he understood every small habit, every subtle expression, yet here she was, sharing them with someone else, as if their shared life had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, Ethan realized that what he had been fearing was real. The man and his wife were not merely acquaintances, they were companions, bound by shared secrecy, laughter, and an intimacy that excluded him entirely. The realization made his chest tighten, his hands tremble slightly. Yet amidst the heartbreak, a spark of resolve began to form. He could not remain passive. He had to uncover the full truth, understand the scope of the betrayal, and prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably follow. Ethan's mind began to plan, to strategize the steps he would take. Once he left the car, he would not act impulsively, would not let raw emotion dictate his actions. But he also knew that patience was essential. He would gather indisputable proof, document the interactions, and ensure that when he confronted them, the reality could not be denied or twisted. Every subtle gesture he had observed, every piece of evidence he could collect, it would be part of the puzzle that he needed to complete before stepping out into the emotional storm he knew awaited him. Night fell, and the cafe's warm light spilled onto the sidewalk, illuminating the figures inside with a soft glow. Ethan leaned back in his seat, a mix of despair and determination settling over him. The betrayal he had glimpsed in the office lobby had now been confirmed, undeniable and raw. Yet, even in the depth of his heartbreak, he felt the first stirrings of clarity, of purpose. He would face this truth, piece together every hidden moment, and confront the reality of his wife's double life. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with emotional peril and moral complexity, but he knew that only by stepping forward into the darkness could he hope to reclaim his life, his dignity, and his sense of self. As he finally started the car, ready to leave but already planning his next move, Ethan understood that this night would mark the beginning of a relentless pursuit of truth, a journey that would test the limits of his patience, resilience, and emotional fortitude. The betrayal was clear, the man's presence undeniable, and now, with each mile, Ethan drove not just through the city streets, but toward the heart of the mystery that had upended his life, a story of deception, heartbreak, and the fragile boundary between trust and betrayal that would demand every ounce of courage he possessed. Ethan's mind raced as he followed the man through the city streets, careful to maintain distance, yet unwilling to let him slip away. Every step was calculated, every turn deliberate, driven by a mix of desperation and a need for answers. The adrenaline coursing through his veins sharpened his senses, heightening awareness of every footstep, every flicker of movement in the shadows. He could feel the tension building, a coil of anticipation and anger, tightening in his chest with each passing block. Finally, the man turned into a quiet side street, slowing his pace as if sensing something or someone behind him. Ethan's heartbeat pounded like a drum in his ears. This was it. This was the moment he had feared and yet longed for. He approached cautiously, keeping his distance, observing every detail. The man was mid-30s, dressed casually, but with a calculated neatness that suggested he took care in presenting himself. His posture was arrogant, confident, almost predatory, and Ethan felt a flicker of protective fury at the thought of him close to the woman he loved. The man's actions, his glances over the shoulder, the slight tension in his gait, all betrayed the knowledge that he was aware of Ethan's potential interference. Yet, Ethan remained steady, forcing himself to breathe, to focus on the evidence, on the proof of the betrayal he had pieced together over the past days. Finally, Ethan stepped out from behind a parked car. His presence, sudden yet controlled, forcing the man to pause mid-stride. "We need to talk," Ethan said, voice low but firm, carrying the weight of betrayal, hurt, and rising anger. The man turned, a flash of surprise crossing his face, quickly masked by an almost smug composure. "Who are you?" he asked, tone wary but practiced, as though accustomed to deflecting confrontation. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had rehearsed this moment endlessly in his mind, anticipating evasions, threats, excuses, but nothing prepared him for the emotional surge that hit him, as the man's presence, so casually arrogant, became the embodiment of the deceit that had infiltrated his life. "What do you want?" the man continued. Though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, Ethan's gaze hardened. "I want to know why she's with you. I want to know how long this has been going on, and I want the truth." The words were calm, deliberate, yet carried an undercurrent of righteous anger. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready for the confrontation, the answers, the undeniable proof of betrayal he had long suspected. The city around them seemed to fade into a blur, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional passerby, all irrelevant. In this moment, nothing existed but the two of them and the invisible thread of deceit that connected them through the woman Ethan loved. The man's expression shifted subtly, a combination of defensiveness and thinly veiled arrogance. "Look," he said, tone carefully measured, "you're misunderstanding. She's—" Ethan cut him off sharply, voice rising. Don't lie. I've seen enough, and I've pieced together enough to know this isn't some misunderstanding. I know she's been with you. I know it's deliberate. Now tell me why." There was a silence, thick and charged, stretching for what felt like minutes, though likely only seconds. The man's eyes flicked briefly to the side street, as if calculating his options, then back to Ethan, now with a trace of apprehension. The first crack in his composure was visible, and Ethan felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He had taken control of the narrative, forced the confrontation to a point where denial alone would not suffice. The conversation escalated quickly, words sharp and deliberate, each exchange fraught with tension. Ethan demanded honesty. The man offered deflection, vague rationalizations, even thinly veiled insults. Ethan's heart pounded, a mix of fury and grief, threatening to overwhelm his careful composure, yet he forced himself to remain steady. Every gesture, every word, every hesitation from the man was catalogued, a mental record that would serve as proof of the deceit that had shattered Ethan's trust. He could feel the moral imbalance, the injustice of the situation, and it fueled a simmering rage that he had to keep contained. The emotional stakes were immense. This wasn't just about jealousy. It was about trust, betrayal, and the violation of a shared life. The confrontation drew the attention of a few passers-by, curious glances toward the two men locked in tense dialogue. Ethan barely registered them. The world had narrowed to a single, sharp point of focus. He pressed further, voice low but insistent, demanding a timeline, asking for details, exposing inconsistencies. The man flinched at moments, caught off guard by the precision of Ethan's questions, the intensity of his focus. the clarity with which he dissected the narrative of deceit. It became increasingly clear to Ethan that the man had not anticipated facing someone who had pieced together the truth so thoroughly, someone who could confront him with undeniable evidence and unwavering purpose. Anger surged alongside grief as Ethan pushed for more, forcing admissions from the man with careful persistence. Every reluctant acknowledgement, every defensive gesture, every attempt at evasion only reinforced the reality of the betrayal. Ethan felt the weight of his emotions pressing down pain, disbelief, fury, but alongside it came clarity, a bitter understanding that the truth, however painful, was now inescapable. He would not be left in uncertainty, would not allow the narrative to remain hidden behind lies and evasions. The confrontation, though raw and exhausting, was the necessary step toward reclaiming his agency, toward forcing the betrayal into the light. By the time the conversation drew to a tentative conclusion, Ethan felt drained yet resolute. He had forced the truth into the open, had confronted the man who had been part of the deception, and had carved out a space in which reality could no longer be denied. The city around them, bustling and indifferent, seemed to settle into quiet significance as Ethan absorbed the impact of what he had learned. The betrayal was real, deliberate, undeniable, and yet, for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of empowerment. He had faced the storm, stood unbroken amidst the chaos, and gained a foothold in the treacherous terrain of heartbreak and deceit. Marcus, who had observed silently from a few steps back, offered a reassuring nod, a reminder that Ethan was not alone, that support and guidance remained. Together, they began planning the next steps, what needed to be confronted, what evidence needed to be preserved, and how Ethan could navigate the emotional maelstrom with clarity and purpose. The confrontation had been only the first step. The journey ahead would demand courage, strategy, and resilience. But in that quiet street, under the fading light of day, Ethan took his first real stride toward reclaiming the narrative of his life, determined to confront the full extent of betrayal. No matter how devastating it might be, Ethan left the street that had borne witness to his confrontation with a hollow ache in his chest, the knowledge of betrayal pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The confirmation he had sought, the undeniable proof that his wife had been sharing her life with another man, was now tangible, etched into every gesture, every interaction he had observed. Yet, the emotional impact was not merely in the facts themselves. It was in the cumulative realization of all the small moments he had missed, the tiny fractures in their life together that now appeared glaringly obvious, each smile she had reserved for someone else, every secretive glance, every unexplained absence, formed a mosaic of deceit that left Ethan staggering under its weight. Back in his apartment, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the evening light spilling weakly through the blinds, casting long, slatted shadows across his face. He opened the laptop and began the painstaking process of uncovering the digital breadcrumbs she had left behind. Emails, messages, social media interactions, photographs. The depth of her duplicity was staggering. She had constructed a private world, a second life, meticulously hidden behind curated smiles, innocuous conversations, and carefully timed absences. Each discovery, each carefully concealed detail, was a hammer blow to Ethan's sense of reality. The woman he had loved, trusted, and shared countless quiet nights with had been performing another life, one that excluded him entirely. Ethan's hands shook as he scrolled through photos and messages, the faces of friends and acquaintances, interwoven with moments he had never known existed. There were subtle cues in posts and private messages, inside jokes, shared memories, even mundane comments that now revealed a network of secrecy he had been blind to. He felt simultaneously violated and enraged, an unbearable mixture of grief and fury consuming him. Yet, amid the torment, a meticulous part of his mind insisted on documenting everything, cataloging the evidence, building an irrefutable case against the deception. If confrontation was inevitable, he would face it armed with certainty, not only with emotion. Hours slipped by unnoticed as Ethan pieced together the story. His apartment, a dimly lit war room of betrayal, he noticed patterns he had never seen before: the late-night check-ins, the carefully staged social media appearances, the subtle avoidance of mutual friends. These weren't random oversights. They were deliberate choices, a careful orchestration that had allowed her to maintain a facade while engaging in an entirely separate narrative. The realization burned deeper than any argument or fight could have. This was premeditated, intentional, and profoundly personal. The trust he had given freely had been exploited, and the depth of the manipulation left him reeling. Marcus remained a silent companion through it all, offering the occasional word of reassurance, a steadying hand on the shoulder when Ethan's frustration threatened to boil over. They discussed the implications of each revelation, the potential motivations, the character of the man involved, and the strategies required to confront both parties effectively. Marcus's calm, logical perspective contrasted sharply with Ethan's raw emotional state. But it was precisely this balance that allowed Ethan to process the growing storm with clarity. Every new piece of evidence was examined, cross-referenced, and weighed, each one a step closer to understanding the full scope of the betrayal. As the night deepened, Ethan found himself confronting memories he had long cherished. Moments of intimacy, shared laughter, whispered confessions in the quiet of their home. All of it now seemed tainted by the realization that she had been splitting her affection, her attention, her trust. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became impossible as his mind replayed interactions, analyzed gestures, and questioned every small inconsistency he had once ignored. He felt a deep, almost physical ache in his chest, a manifestation of heartbreak and the dizzying vertigo of disbelief. The world seemed unmoored, ordinary objects in his apartment now charged with meaning, each item a reminder of what had been shared and what had been stolen. By the early hours of the morning, Ethan had begun to see the outlines of a path forward. While the emotional devastation was profound, he recognized that clarity was emerging from the chaos. The evidence he had compiled, the patterns he had uncovered, and the confrontation he had already initiated provided a foundation for the next steps. He would confront his wife directly, armed with the proof of her duplicity, and demand accountability for the choices she had made. But beyond confrontation, Ethan also began to understand the necessity of self-preservation. Trust had been broken, but his dignity, his integrity, and his ability to define the course of his own life were still within his control. In the early morning light, Ethan felt a paradoxical mixture of exhaustion and empowerment. The betrayal had shattered illusions, ripped apart the comforting fabric of his daily life, and forced him to confront the darkest corners of his relationship. Yet within that devastation, a clarity emerged. He could not change the past, could not undo the choices of another, but he could determine how he would respond. Each step he had taken, the observations, the investigation, the confrontation with the other man, the meticulous gathering of evidence, was a reclaiming of agency, a refusal to be passive in the face of betrayal. The city outside his window stirred to life, oblivious to the storm he had weathered, and yet he felt, for the first time in days, a glimmer of control, a fragile but real sense that he could navigate the labyrinth of deception before him. Ethan knew that what awaited him would be painful, that the confrontation with his wife would demand every ounce of courage he possessed. Yet he also knew that this confrontation was necessary, not only for closure, but for the preservation of his own emotional and moral integrity. The betrayal had been laid bare, undeniable and complete, and now the responsibility rested with him to act decisively, to reclaim his narrative, and to navigate the treacherous terrain of heartbreak with clarity and resolve. The emotional landscape was perilous, yet within the devastation lay the seeds of resilience, the beginnings of a path toward healing, and the promise that, despite the depth of the betrayal, he would emerge intact, fortified, and prepared for the truths yet to be revealed. Ethan stood across the street from the small café, the dim glow of its interior spilling onto the sidewalk in golden patches, illuminating the truth he had dreaded yet anticipated. There she was, his wife seated at a corner table with the man he had seen before, their bodies leaning slightly toward one another, the ease of their familiarity striking like a physical blow. He watched, heart pounding, as she laughed at something the man had said, the sound once reserved for him now shared freely with someone else. Each gesture, each tilt of her head, each fleeting glance was evidence of the life she had been living behind his back, a narrative that excluded him entirely. Ethan's stomach twisted, anger and heartbreak intertwining into a knot that threatened to consume him. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe steadily. The scene before him was undeniable, a confirmation of the betrayal he had pieced together through careful observation, digital clues, and painstaking investigation. The sense of injustice was palpable, an almost physical presence pressing against his chest. He remembered the countless nights they had spent together, the quiet dinners, the soft conversations, the intimate moments that had once felt unshakable, and realized that all of it had been intertwined with deception, manipulated by a hidden agenda he had only now begun to comprehend. The emotional impact was staggering, leaving him momentarily paralyzed on the sidewalk, caught between the desire to confront and the need to absorb the reality before him. Marcus, standing a few steps back, placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a grounding presence in the swirling storm of his emotions. "We need to be careful," he murmured, voice low and steady. Ethan nodded, acknowledging the wisdom and restraint, though the urge to storm in, to demand explanations, to unleash the torrent of his pain, was almost irresistible. The methodical part of him, the part trained to act with precision and clarity in moments of crisis, insisted on patience, observation first, confirmation second, confrontation last. But even with that clarity, the emotional turmoil raged within him, each heartbeat echoing the profound betrayal he had just witnessed. As they waited, Ethan's mind replayed every subtle cue he had missed in recent weeks. The late-night calls, the vague excuses about work commitments, the moments when she seemed distracted or secretive. Each memory, once comforting, now took on a sinister quality, suggesting that her actions had been deliberate, orchestrated to maintain a facade while she cultivated a separate, hidden life. The thought of this duality, the calculated separation of her attention and affection, he made his chest tighten, grief and fury mingling in a volatile mixture. He realized that trust, something he had given freely and without hesitation, had been weaponized against him, used to shield a betrayal that was now laid bare. He observed the man more closely. The other man's presence was deliberate, his posture confident, the casual arrogance of someone who believed they could manipulate reality without consequence. Every smile, every casual touch, every moment of shared laughter reinforced the depth of Ethan's pain, yet also illuminated the necessity of facing the truth directly. This confrontation was not simply about uncovering the facts. It was about reclaiming agency, asserting the right to understand, to question, and ultimately to demand accountability. Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the railing in front of him, grounding himself in the certainty that he would not be a passive observer of his own life. Time seemed to stretch as he weighed his options, each second carrying immense emotional weight. Should he approach now, demand answers in the heat of raw emotion, or wait until he had prepared himself, gathered evidence, and ensured that the confrontation could not be deflected or denied? His mind oscillated between the urgent need to act and the strategic patience he had cultivated over days of observation and reflection. Every conceivable scenario played out in his imagination: the anger, the denials, the justifications, the potential for violence, the collapse of the facade. But through it all, he maintained a fierce clarity. He would face the truth, and he would do so with precision and intention. Finally, Ethan stepped onto the street, crossing with measured purpose, the ambient city noise fading into a backdrop for the storm within him. He approached the table slowly, deliberately, allowing the weight of his presence to register. Before initiating confrontation, his wife looked up, the recognition flashing in her eyes, followed by a subtle shift, a defensive posture. The man, meanwhile, stiffened, aware that the equilibrium had shifted. Ethan's voice, calm yet charged with emotion, broke the tense silence. "We need to talk," he said, the simple words carrying the gravity of months of betrayal and weeks of preparation. The cafe's warm light illuminated their faces, highlighting every flicker of emotion, every subtle micro-expression that betrayed truth from pretense. The conversation began with carefully chosen words, Ethan demanding clarity, honesty, and acknowledgement of actions. His wife's initial reaction was defensive, a combination of surprise, indignation, and thinly veiled contempt. She attempted rationalization, weaving half-truths with excuses, each explanation carefully constructed to deflect responsibility. The man, sensing the confrontation's intensity, mirrored her stance, deflecting and defending. But Ethan's focused presence, the meticulous evidence he had gathered, and the raw emotional clarity in his demeanor left little room for deception. Each admission, each faltering statement, each defensive gesture further reinforced the reality he had uncovered and provided undeniable confirmation of the betrayal. Ethan's heart pounded as he maintained composure, listening intently, observing every nuance, cataloging every inconsistency. The emotional stakes were immense. Every word, every hesitation, every glance carried the weight of months of deceit and the fragile remnants of a life he had once trusted implicitly. He felt the righteous anger coiling within him, but he channeled it into focus, using it to navigate the confrontation with precision. This was not a moment for reckless emotion. It was a moment to establish clarity, to demand truth, and to assert his agency in a situation deliberately constructed to undermine it. By the time the initial exchanges concluded, the weight of evidence, the undeniable presence of the other man, and the exposure of his wife's duplicity had stripped away the layers of pretense. Ethan stood firm, a mixture of heartbreak and resolve etched across his face. He had confronted the betrayal, faced the truth, and asserted control over a narrative that had been carefully manipulated against him. The cafe's soft light cast long shadows, highlighting the raw, unvarnished reality of the confrontation, a scene that would remain seared into his memory. The culmination of uncertainty, suspicion, and mounting dread transformed into undeniable clarity and confrontation. The confrontation at the cafe left Ethan reeling, the emotional whirlwind refusing to settle. Even as he stepped back onto the bustling city streets, he felt a raw mixture of anger, grief, and disbelief swirling inside him, each emotion demanding recognition, each memory of betrayal pressing relentlessly against his chest. He needed perspective, someone outside of the immediate chaos to help him navigate the turbulence of heartbreak. That's when he reached for his phone and dialed his sister, Claire, a woman whose judgment he trusted implicitly and whose calm presence had guided him through countless crises in the past. Claire answered almost immediately, her voice a soothing balm amid the storm. "Ethan, what's wrong?" she asked, sensing the tension even before he spoke. He explained the events of the day, the confrontation at the cafe, the undeniable proof of his wife's infidelity, the raw pain of betrayal. As he spoke, he felt the tight knot in his chest loosen slightly, the act of voicing his turmoil, giving shape to the chaos inside him. Claire's reactions were measured and empathetic, a stark contrast to the emotional roller coaster he had endured alone. She offered guidance, suggesting he focus first on understanding the full scope of the situation before taking any irreversible actions. With Claire's support, Ethan began reaching out to other friends and confidants, people who had observed parts of his marriage or who had interacted with his wife in social or professional contexts. Each conversation was a delicate exercise in discretion and emotional restraint. He needed insight without alerting the others that he was aware of the betrayal. Some friends were supportive, offering reassurance and practical advice. Others were dismissive or judgmental, questioning his reaction or suggesting that he had misinterpreted events. The conflicting feedback only intensified the emotional complexity, forcing Ethan to weigh every opinion carefully, to navigate the delicate balance between self-preservation and social pressures. As the hours passed, Ethan began compiling a detailed chronology of events: the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the moments she had vanished without explanation. They all formed a timeline that highlighted the meticulousness of the betrayal. Each detail reinforced the harsh reality. This was no accident, no momentary lapse in judgment. It had been deliberate, calculated, and ongoing. The emotional weight of this realization was immense, but documenting it provided Ethan with a sense of control, a way to reclaim agency in a life that had been thrown into chaos. The deeper Ethan delved, the more apparent it became that the other man was not simply a passive participant, but an active agent in the deception. Evidence emerged of intentional manipulation, subtle attempts to obscure interactions, and signs that he had knowingly inserted himself into Ethan's domestic life. This discovery intensified Ethan's protective instincts, not only toward himself, but also toward the life he had built, the shared home. The memories, the commitments that had been violated, the depth of the duplicity was staggering, and with each revelation, Ethan felt both the crushing weight of heartbreak and the fiery spark of resolve that would drive him forward. Even as the day faded into evening, Ethan continued his investigations, reaching out discreetly to mutual acquaintances, observing patterns of behavior, and cross-referencing details to form a coherent picture. The process was emotionally exhausting, but it was necessary. Every new piece of information, every subtle acknowledgement from someone who had glimpsed moments of the hidden relationship, contributed to a fuller understanding of the betrayal's scope. The painstaking work was not merely about proving infidelity, it was about reclaiming clarity, about ensuring that when confrontation came, it would be precise, informed, and unassailable. Marcus remained a constant presence, a stabilizing force amid the emotional turmoil. His calm analysis, his ability to offer strategic insights without judgment, provided Ethan with a framework to process the situation rationally. Together, they planned a series of steps: continued observation of the wife and her companion, careful documentation of interactions, and preparation for the eventual confrontation that would demand both emotional resilience and tactical precision. Marcus's support was invaluable, a reminder that even in the depths of betrayal, Ethan was not entirely alone. By nightfall, Ethan felt the cumulative weight of the day pressing upon him. The emotional toll of discovery, combined with the relentless search for clarity, left him physically and mentally drained. He walked through the quiet streets, the city's ambient noises, a distant siren, the hum of traffic, the occasional footsteps of late-night passers-by blurring into a backdrop for the storm inside his mind. Yet, despite the exhaustion, a sense of determination began to crystallize. He could not undo the betrayal, but he could confront it, understand its depth, and ensure that the truth could no longer be hidden. This clarity, though painful, offered a measure of empowerment, a fragile but real foothold amid the chaos. The day's experiences had reinforced an important realization. Betrayal was not only about the act itself, but also about the manipulation of perception, the careful orchestration of appearances, and the subtle erosion of trust over time. Ethan understood that his journey was not merely about uncovering infidelity, it was about confronting a reality that had been deliberately concealed and reclaiming the authority to define his own narrative. The confrontation at the café had been the first step, but the work ahead, gathering evidence, understanding the full scope, and preparing for the emotional reckoning, would require patience, courage, and unwavering focus. In the solitude of his apartment, Ethan reflected on the intricate web of deception, the delicate dance of appearances, and the profound emotional impact of the betrayal. He realized that moving forward would require not only confronting his wife and the other man, but also rebuilding his sense of trust, self-worth, and agency. The support of Claire and Marcus provided a foundation, yet the ultimate responsibility rested with him. to navigate the complex emotional landscape with clarity, to demand accountability, and to preserve his integrity amid the upheaval. The journey was only beginning, and though the path ahead was fraught with pain, it also held the potential for understanding, resolution, and, ultimately, healing. Ethan's investigation into the other man's background began with a subtle online search, one that revealed more than he had anticipated. The man's public persona was carefully curated, polished, and deliberate, but traces of past relationships and patterns of behavior slowly emerged like faint footprints in sand. Ethan discovered hints of manipulation in previous partnerships, stories of charm, masking, entitlement, and a streak of self-interest that cut through the veneer of affability. Each revelation intensified Ethan's protective instincts, highlighting not just the personal betrayal he had endured, but also the potentially dangerous consequences of allowing this man to continue influencing his wife's life unchecked. The more Ethan delved, the more connections became apparent. Mutual friends, colleagues, and social media networks provided subtle hints that this was not an isolated incident. The other man had consistently positioned himself within close proximity to his victims, exploiting vulnerabilities and fostering dependence. Ethan's mind raced as he traced timelines, cross-referenced interactions, and pieced together moments that had once seemed innocuous. It became painfully clear that this individual was not merely a fleeting presence in his wife's life, but a deliberate and calculating figure, capable of engineering situations that would facilitate the emotional and psychological betrayal Ethan had been subjected to. Marcus, observing Ethan's growing focus, reminded him to maintain caution. "We need to be methodical," he advised, his voice calm amidst Ethan's swirling storm of fury and heartbreak. Ethan nodded, understanding the wisdom in restraint. Confrontation without preparation would be reckless. The man's manipulative tendencies suggested he might twist the narrative, evade responsibility, or provoke a reaction that could harm Ethan emotionally or legally. The stakes were higher than Ethan had initially realized, and he recognized that strategic planning was essential, not only for uncovering the truth, but also for ensuring the confrontation would be controlled, deliberate, and conclusive. Over the next several days, Ethan compiled a dossier of interactions, messages, and social patterns, cataloging each anomaly and incongruence with meticulous attention to detail. Every social media post, every sudden disappearance, every evasive response from mutual acquaintances became a piece of the larger mosaic of betrayal. The process was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but it provided a sense of control amid the chaos. Each documented inconsistency was a step toward clarity, a tangible measure of understanding that countered the helplessness he had felt in the days immediately following the receptionist's revelation. Ethan began to see the other man's methods more clearly. His charm, while superficially benign, was carefully calibrated to disarm, to engender trust, and to manipulate perceptions. Ethan's anger grew as he realized the extent to which this man had inserted himself into his life, exploiting both the nuances of his wife's emotional landscape and the blind spots of their domestic routine. The calculated nature of the betrayal was almost surgical in its precision. Each interaction, each omission, and each hidden gesture designed to isolate Ethan and facilitate the other man's access. The enormity of this orchestration struck Ethan like a physical blow, yet it also reinforced his resolve. The confrontation could not be impulsive. It had to be meticulously orchestrated to ensure truth prevailed over deception. The psychological toll on Ethan was immense. Nights were sleepless, filled with replayed conversations, imagined confrontations, and relentless analysis of behavior. He alternated between despair and determination, the emotional pendulum swinging wildly as he considered the depth of the manipulation and the consequences for his life. Yet through this tumult, Ethan's clarity sharpened. He understood that exposing the other man's true character, presenting incontrovertible evidence of deceit, and demanding accountability were not merely acts of retribution. They were essential steps toward reclaiming agency, self-respect, and control over a narrative that had been hijacked. Through careful investigation, Ethan discovered subtle financial irregularities, vague employment histories, and minor legal entanglements associated with the other man, all of which painted a picture of someone accustomed to weaving through life with a degree of opportunistic cunning. Marcus helped Ethan organize these findings, creating a strategic plan for leveraging the information in a confrontation designed to prevent evasion or deflection. The meticulous compilation of evidence provided Ethan with a psychological anchor, a means of converting raw emotional pain into actionable strategy. Every documented interaction strengthened his ability to face both the other man and his wife with confidence, ensuring that the confrontation would not be derailed by manipulation or denial. By the end of the week, Ethan had achieved a comprehensive understanding of the other man's personality, motives, and behavioral patterns. Each discovery reinforced the necessity of confronting the betrayal decisively, yet also tempered his anger with clarity. He recognized that the confrontation would be emotionally charged, potentially explosive, but preparation offered him a measure of control. The evidence he had gathered would allow him to structure the encounter to ensure accountability, mitigate escalation, and ultimately force the truth into the open. In reflecting on the journey thus far, Ethan realized that the betrayal had been as much about manipulation and control as it had been about emotional infidelity. The other man's presence in their lives had been calculated, methodical, and deliberate, exploiting vulnerabilities with precision. Understanding this allowed Ethan to approach the forthcoming confrontation not just with righteous anger, but with strategic foresight and moral authority. He was no longer a passive victim of circumstance. He was a man armed with knowledge, insight, and the determination to reclaim control over his life and the narrative that had been stolen from him. As he prepared for the next phase, facing his wife directly, with irrefutable evidence and confronting the man who had intruded upon their life, Ethan felt a mixture of apprehension and steely resolve. The emotional storm was far from over, but with clarity, preparation, and support from Marcus, he was ready to confront the full scope of betrayal, ensuring that deception could no longer hide in the shadows. The journey was painful, the stakes high, but Ethan's resolve was unwavering. His focus, sharpened by the brutal lessons of trust, manipulation, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Ethan's world had shrunk to the dimensions of his apartment, each room heavy with silence, each shadow a reminder of the betrayal he had uncovered. Sleep had become a stranger, replaced by restless nights, where memories and possibilities collided, each one sharper and more agonizing than the last. He replayed the café confrontation, the unmistakable intimacy between his wife and the other man, and the meticulous planning he had undertaken to uncover the truth. The combination of heartbreak and rage left him physically drained, yet mentally alert, his mind a constant whirlwind of reflection, analysis, and raw emotion. Every creak in the floorboards, every distant car horn, every passing footstep outside his window became magnified, as if the city itself were participating in the silent torment of his mind. He sank into a chair by the window, the night sky above the city punctuated by scattered lights, each one a distant reminder of lives continuing. Oblivious to the devastation he faced, the apartment, once a sanctuary filled with shared laughter and quiet intimacy, now felt alien, the familiar walls echoing with absence. Ethan's thoughts spiraled, a relentless mix of recollection and speculation. He thought of the subtle signs he had ignored, the vague excuses, the late-night disappearances, the fleeting expressions of anxiety she had masked so effortlessly. In retrospect, they were glaring, unavoidable, yet he had been blind to them, lulled by trust and affection into a fragile sense of security. The realization of how thoroughly he had been deceived left him trembling, both with sorrow and the raw power of betrayal. The psychological weight of this knowledge was immense. Ethan felt as though he were suspended in a space between two realities, the life he had believed in and the one now laid bare before him. He recalled moments of domestic bliss, the laughter, the shared plans, the whispered assurances of love, now tainted by the knowledge of hidden motives and deliberate deceit. Each memory, once comforting, had become a lens through which the scope of betrayal was magnified. He recognized the insidious nature of the manipulation. It was not merely an emotional affair, but a carefully orchestrated intrusion into the fabric of his domestic life, a systematic undermining of trust and intimacy. The depth of its complexity both horrified and compelled him, forcing him to confront not only his wife's duplicity, but also the calculated involvement of the other man. Ethan's hands shook as he documented every detail, writing down timelines, messages, and interactions with meticulous precision. The act of recording, of translating chaotic emotion into tangible evidence, provided a measure of control amid the psychological storm. Each note, each verified instance, was a small assertion of agency, a way to reclaim the narrative that had been usurped by deception. Marcus's presence was invaluable during this time, offering objective insights and practical suggestions, helping Ethan structure the information in a way that would support the forthcoming confrontation. The planning was exhaustive, yet essential. Without it, the confrontation risked devolving into chaos, leaving Ethan vulnerable to manipulation or emotional collapse. The nights were the hardest, alone. Ethan confronted the full emotional impact of what had transpired. He wept quietly, mourning the life he had believed in, the intimacy that had been shared and betrayed, and the trust that had been broken with deliberate precision. Each tear was both an acknowledgement of loss and a step toward processing the reality he faced. Yet even in grief, a thread of resolve emerged, a determination to face the betrayal head-on, to ensure that deception could no longer manipulate his perception, and to reclaim control over his own life. The emotional breakdown, painful as it was, became a crucible in which clarity and resolve began to form. Ethan's mind oscillated between moments of despair and bursts of strategic focus. He envisioned the confrontation with his wife, rehearsing questions, anticipating evasions, and preparing for emotional defenses. The other man's role, already clearly documented, would be addressed with precision, exposing the manipulation and enforcing accountability. Ethan understood that the confrontation would be intense, possibly explosive, but the meticulous preparation he had undertaken provided a sense of fortification. He was no longer a passive observer of his own life. He had become an active agent, armed with evidence, clarity, and determination to face the truth in all its rawness. Through the late hours, Ethan reflected not only on the betrayal, but on his own emotional responses. The pain, the anger, the despair, all were natural, yet he recognized the importance of channeling them constructively. The goal was not revenge, not impulsive retaliation, but the assertion of truth, the demand for accountability, and the preservation of his dignity. Each tear shed, each sleepless night endured, each detail meticulously recorded, became part of a broader process of reclaiming his sense of self and agency. Ethan realized that healing and empowerment were not instantaneous. They were processes forged through confrontation, understanding, and the deliberate engagement with painful truths. As dawn approached, a fragile sense of calm settled over him. The psychological storm remained, but beneath the tempest, clarity had begun to take root. He knew that the confrontation would be inevitable, that emotional turmoil would flare, and that the journey through betrayal and deceit was far from complete. Yet, for the first time in days, Ethan felt a measure of readiness. He had documented the patterns, understood the manipulations, and prepared his mind for the emotional intensity to come. The night had been long, the heartbreak profound, but in facing the depths of deception alone, Ethan had forged a foundation of resilience, insight, and moral authority that would carry him through the challenges that lay ahead. The city stirred to life outside his window. Oblivious to the personal tempest that had unfolded within the apartment, Ethan drew a deep breath, grounding himself in the quiet resolve that had begun to form. The emotional collapse had been necessary, the grief unavoidable, but now, tempered by clarity and preparation, he felt ready. Ready to confront, ready to demand truth, and ready to reclaim control over a life that had been disrupted by betrayal. The journey of healing had begun in earnest, and while the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with emotional peril, Ethan knew that facing the darkness of deception directly was the only way to emerge stronger, wiser, and more firmly in command of his own destiny. Ethan spent the morning in careful preparation, the weight of the past weeks pressing on him, even as his mind worked methodically through every detail of the confrontation that lay ahead. Every piece of evidence he had gathered, the digital breadcrumbs, the observed interactions, the subtle inconsistencies, needed to be organized, precise, and undeniable. He knew that this final confrontation would require not just courage, but strategic clarity. Any lapse, any misstep could allow deceit to persist, manipulation to continue, or even escalate the emotional damage. Marcus sat quietly across from him, reviewing notes, confirming timelines, and suggesting ways to present the evidence so that the truth could not be twisted or evaded. Together, they devised a plan that balanced emotional impact with unassailable clarity, a structure designed to force honesty and accountability. By late afternoon, Ethan was ready. The café, from which the affair had been confirmed, became the venue for this decisive confrontation, chosen both for its familiarity and its exposure. Every detail had been considered: the seating arrangements, the timing of arrival, the subtle observation of the other man's usual routines, and the careful documentation of previous interactions. Ethan's hands tightened around the edge of the chair he sat in, his chest heavy with anticipation. He felt a mixture of dread and resolve. The emotional intensity of the betrayal, tempered by the meticulous preparation that gave him agency over the situation. The storm of heartbreak was present, but it was now anchored by a foundation of purpose and clarity. When she arrived, accompanied by the other man, Ethan observed their movements, cataloging every nuance. Her familiar smile, once shared exclusively with him, was now extended elsewhere. The ease of their interaction, the subtle intimacy of gestures and glances, highlighted the depth of the betrayal in stark relief. Ethan's pulse surged, a combination of fury and grief, threatening to overwhelm him, but he held himself steady, drawing upon the mental and emotional preparation he had undertaken for this moment. The confrontation was not impulsive, it was deliberate, measured, and calibrated to ensure that the truth would emerge unchallenged. Ethan initiated the confrontation with a calm authority, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk," he said, the simplicity of the phrase carrying the weight of weeks of investigation, sleepless nights, and emotional upheaval. Her initial reaction was a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by defensiveness and controlled indignation. The other man mirrored her stance, an almost instinctive defensive posture, yet the evidence Ethan had meticulously gathered created a tangible framework that constrained evasions. Every question Ethan posed, every piece of proof he presented, reinforced the reality of the betrayal, rendering lies and rationalizations increasingly untenable. The dialogue escalated with intensity, words exchanged like deliberate strikes in a psychological duel. Ethan demanded clarity about the timelines, the motives, and the depth of the deception. His wife attempted justification, offering partial truths and excuses. But the structured evidence, combined with Ethan's unwavering focus, undermined each attempt. The other man's composure began to falter as inconsistencies were highlighted, gaps in stories exposed, and the carefully maintained facade of charm cracked under the pressure of unassailable facts. Ethan's strategic approach ensured that the confrontation remained under his control, preventing manipulation or deflection from dictating the narrative. As the conversation continued, Ethan observed subtle signs of guilt and recognition in their expressions. Micro-expressions betrayed truths they could not entirely conceal: the slight hesitation before an answer, the avoidance of direct eye contact, the tension in posture. Each detail, cataloged and analyzed, served to strengthen Ethan's position, confirming that his perception of the betrayal was accurate. The emotional intensity was immense, yet beneath the heartbreak, a sense of vindication emerged. The calculated exposure of deceit had forced the truth into the open, stripping away the layers of manipulation that had allowed the betrayal to persist. Ethan maintained composure, his anger channeled into precision rather than chaos. Every question was carefully crafted, every statement deliberate, designed to ensure accountability while minimizing the risk of escalation. The café, with its ordinary hum of background noise and casual patrons, became a stage for this unfolding drama. Each movement and exchange heightened by the intimacy and exposure of the setting. The surrounding environment, neutral yet public, amplified the consequences of evasion and deception, compelling honesty through visibility and undeniable evidence. After what felt like hours, though was likely only a fraction of that, the confrontation reached its apex. Admissions, however reluctant, were extracted, the intricacies of the affair laid bare. The other man, confronted with clear documentation and the moral authority of Ethan's structured approach, could no longer maintain his narrative of innocence. Similarly, Ethan's wife, faced with undeniable evidence and the relentless clarity of questioning, could no longer obscure the truth. The emotional weight of the revelations was intense, but clarity and accountability had been achieved. The storm of deception, long hidden, was finally exposed, leaving no room for denial or obfuscation. Ethan felt a mixture of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. The confrontation, while emotionally taxing, had achieved its purpose. The truth was laid bare, the manipulation unmasked, and the boundaries of accountability firmly established. The raw intensity of betrayal had been met with strategic, deliberate action, converting pain and heartbreak into clarity and control. Marcus's steady presence had ensured that Ethan's approach remained methodical and grounded, preventing impulsive reactions and supporting the effective presentation of evidence. Together, they had transformed chaos into clarity, preparing the stage for the next phase of resolution and eventual healing. In the quiet aftermath, Ethan reflected on the enormity of what had transpired. The betrayal, meticulously orchestrated, had been confronted with precision, the other man's role exposed, and his wife's duplicity laid bare. While the emotional scars remained, the strategic confrontation had allowed Ethan to reclaim agency over his narrative, to assert control over a life that had been disrupted by deception. The process had been exhaustive, emotionally draining, and psychologically intense, yet it had achieved a vital outcome: the unassailable exposure of truth, the affirmation of his perception, and the establishment of moral authority amid the chaos of betrayal. The confrontation marked not only the revelation of the affair, but also the beginning of a new chapter, one in which Ethan could navigate the aftermath with clarity, understanding, and an informed sense of empowerment. The storm of emotion, while not yet fully settled, had been directed toward resolution, accountability, and the reclamation of control, setting the stage for the subsequent journey of justice, reflection, and eventual healing. In facing the full extent of betrayal, Ethan had demonstrated resilience, strategic acumen, and the courage to confront the darkest truths of his life, laying the groundwork for the resolution that awaited him in the coming days. In the days following the confrontation, Ethan witnessed the immediate consequences of the betrayal he had uncovered. His wife, now fully aware that the duplicity could no longer be hidden, exhibited a mixture of defiance and shame. The man she had been seeing attempted to justify himself, but the evidence Ethan had meticulously gathered left no room for evasion. Public exposure, the clarity of documented interactions, and the emotional authority Ethan wielded during the confrontation had forced accountability. It was as though the carefully constructed illusions had shattered in the bright light of truth, leaving both of them vulnerable to the undeniable weight of their actions. Ethan noticed subtle changes in their social circle as well. Friends who had previously maintained a neutral stance began to react, some expressing outrage at the deceit, others offering cautious support. The social consequences of the betrayal were as tangible as the emotional ones. Invitations were rescinded, interactions became strained, and whispered conversations followed them, evidence that the ripples of deceit extended far beyond the personal sphere. Ethan observed these shifts with a mixture of detachment and satisfaction, recognizing that accountability extended beyond the immediate confrontation. The other man's reputation suffered, revealing patterns of manipulation that others had previously ignored, and Ethan's vigilance ensured that the truth could no longer be obscured by charm or deception. As the immediate fallout settled, Ethan turned his attention to the practical aspects of disentangling his life from the web of betrayal. Financial arrangements, shared responsibilities, and domestic routines all required careful negotiation. He approached these matters with a measured calm, drawing on the clarity and preparation that had guided him through the confrontation. Each decision, from the division of shared assets to the reorganization of household logistics, reinforced his sense of agency. While the emotional impact of the betrayal remained profound, Ethan's ability to assert control over the practical realities of his life provided a stabilizing anchor, allowing him to navigate the chaos with reasoned precision. Throughout this period, Marcus remained a steadfast presence, offering not only practical guidance, but also emotional support. Together, they devised strategies to manage interactions with his wife and the other man, ensuring that encounters were conducted with clarity, accountability, and minimal risk of manipulation. Marcus's calm perspective helped Ethan temper impulsive reactions, transforming raw emotional energy into deliberate, strategic action. In this partnership, Ethan found not only assistance, but also reinforcement of his own resilience, a reminder that even in the depths of betrayal, support and guidance could be found. Ethan also began to reflect deeply on the nature of trust and manipulation. The betrayal had not been sudden or impulsive. It had been calculated, deliberate, and meticulously orchestrated. Understanding the psychological mechanisms at play, the subtle manipulations, the exploitation of vulnerability, and the careful management of appearances was essential to reclaiming his sense of self. Each reflection reinforced the importance of vigilance, self-respect, and the ability to navigate complex emotional landscapes with discernment. Ethan's heartbreak, though acute, became a teacher, providing insights into human behavior, boundaries, and the fragile nature of trust. The process of healing was gradual but deliberate. Ethan sought therapy, spending hours unpacking the emotional trauma, processing the grief, and developing strategies for resilience. He rebuilt routines that had been disrupted by deceit, engaged in activities that reinforced autonomy and self-efficacy, and strengthened connections with friends and family who provided authentic support. The emotional recovery was punctuated by moments of reflection on the betrayal, the confrontation, and the aftermath. Each step forward reinforced a growing sense of empowerment, a recognition that while the betrayal had inflicted profound pain, it could not define his future. In parallel, Ethan observed the consequences for the other man and his wife unfold naturally. The social repercussions, professional consequences, and erosion of trust in personal relationships served as external affirmation of accountability. Witnessing the tangible outcomes of deceit reinforced Ethan's understanding that actions, no matter how concealed initially, carry consequences. The other man's attempts to manipulate or rationalize were increasingly ineffective in the face of documented evidence, social scrutiny, and the moral authority Ethan now wielded. Similarly, his wife's position, once comfortably shielded by charm and secrecy, became precarious as trust eroded, and her duplicity became widely recognized. Through these experiences, Ethan began to reclaim his sense of identity and self-worth. The betrayal, while devastating, had highlighted his capacity for resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional strength. Each decision, each calculated response, and each step toward clarity reinforced his autonomy and ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. The journey from shock and grief to empowerment was neither linear nor easy, but it was transformative. Ethan emerged from the immediate aftermath with a heightened understanding of human behavior, emotional intelligence, and the importance of maintaining agency in the face of deceit. By the end of the month, Ethan had established a new equilibrium. The confrontation had laid bare the full scope of the betrayal. The consequences had been enacted, and his life was no longer entangled with deception. The process of rebuilding, both emotionally and practically, continued, but the clarity and control he had achieved provided a firm foundation. He had navigated the storm of betrayal with courage and strategy, reclaimed his narrative, and ensured that truth and accountability prevailed. The journey had been painful, but it had also been instructive, revealing the resilience, insight, and fortitude that had always existed within him, now fully realized through the crucible of adversity. In the weeks following the confrontation and the initial fallout, Ethan began the painstaking process of healing. The emotional scars left by betrayal ran deep, threading through every corner of his mind and memory. But he approached the journey with deliberate intention. Mornings were no longer filled with frantic searches or obsessive reflections on his wife's duplicity. Instead, he created a structured routine that combined physical activity, reflective journaling, and time spent with friends who had remained steadfast throughout his ordeal. Each small step reinforced a growing sense of agency and control, a recognition that while he could not undo the past, he could shape the trajectory of his own recovery. Therapy became a cornerstone of his healing process. In these sessions, Ethan confronted the layers of grief, anger, and confusion that had accumulated over months of betrayal. He explored the subtle manipulations that had eroded trust, the emotional fractures that had gone unnoticed, and the internalized guilt he had carried unnecessarily. Slowly, he began to untangle the threads of responsibility, recognizing that the deceit was not a reflection of his worth, but rather a testament to the calculated actions of others. With each revelation in therapy, he reclaimed a fragment of self-respect, building an internal framework resilient to the manipulation that had once threatened to define him. Socially, Ethan began to reestablish connections that had been strained or neglected. Friends who had observed the unfolding events without judgment became pillars of support, offering both comfort and guidance. Their encouragement helped Ethan regain confidence in his capacity to trust and engage with others without fear of exploitation. He also forged new relationships, cautiously but purposefully, recognizing that the ability to connect authentically was a vital component of emotional recovery. Each interaction, each shared experience, became a subtle reaffirmation that his life could continue meaningfully beyond the shadow of betrayal. Ethan's reflection on the other man and his wife continued to be instructive, observing the consequences of their actions in social and professional spheres provided a concrete understanding of accountability. The other man's reputation suffered under scrutiny, exposing patterns of manipulation that had gone unnoticed by many. His wife, confronted with the full extent of her choices, faced both social and emotional repercussions that could not be ignored. Witnessing these outcomes reinforced Ethan's understanding that actions carry consequences and that integrity and honesty, though sometimes painful in their enforcement, are essential in navigating relationships and life choices. Practical matters also demanded attention. Ethan methodically disentangled shared responsibilities and assets, ensuring clarity and fairness in their division. Legal consultations and financial reviews provided reassurance that the tangible consequences of betrayal were addressed appropriately, preventing the situation from undermining his stability further. Each resolved matter, no matter how small, contributed to a growing sense of empowerment, the ability to confront the practical realities of life while processing emotional trauma reinforced Ethan's autonomy, enabling him to move forward with confidence rather than being mired in chaos or resentment. Amidst this rebuilding, Ethan discovered an unexpected resilience within himself. The pain of betrayal, while acute and undeniable, had illuminated capacities for patience, strategic thinking, and emotional regulation that he had previously underestimated. Each challenge he navigated, each emotionally charged decision he executed with clarity, strengthened his internal framework. He recognized that resilience was not the absence of vulnerability, but the ability to integrate pain into growth, to transform grief into actionable insight, and to maintain integrity in the face of profound personal violation. This understanding became a guiding principle in his journey, offering both perspective and hope. Ethan also began to explore personal interests and pursuits that had been neglected during the turbulence of the betrayal. Hobbies, creative endeavors, and professional projects provided both distraction and enrichment, offering tangible reinforcement of his capacity to live fully despite past wounds. These activities became symbolic markers of independence and self-determination, tangible expressions of his reclamation of life and identity. Each accomplishment, each moment of engagement with the world outside the betrayal, strengthened his emotional foundation, reinforcing the lessons of resilience, awareness, and strategic discernment. Gradually, Ethan's sense of self evolved. He no longer defined himself solely by the betrayal or the emotional devastation it caused. Instead, he cultivated a multi-dimensional identity, grounded in integrity, agency, and the ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics with insight. He understood that while betrayal leaves indelible marks, it does not define the totality of one's life or worth. This perspective allowed him to approach future relationships, both personal and professional, with cautious optimism, informed by experience, but not constrained by fear. The clarity gained from confrontation, observation, and reflection became a cornerstone of his ongoing development. By the end of this period, Ethan had established a life that balanced reflection, healing, and proactive engagement with the world. The betrayal he endured had transformed from a source of raw, paralyzing pain into a catalyst for growth, awareness, and resilience. He had confronted the truth, ensured accountability, navigated emotional and practical challenges, and begun reconstructing a life defined not by deception, but by clarity, integrity, and agency. The journey was ongoing, yet each step reinforced the capacity for recovery, the importance of vigilance and trust, and the profound strength that emerges when one faces betrayal with courage, strategy, and self-respect. Through this process, Ethan learned a vital truth. Betrayal, while devastating, can catalyze self-discovery, emotional fortitude, and a renewed sense of personal authority. Healing is neither instantaneous nor linear, but deliberate, grounded in reflection, support, and actionable steps that reclaim agency and preserve dignity. In facing the darkest chapters of his life, Ethan not only confronted the deceit of others, but also unearthed the depth of his own resilience, the clarity of his moral compass, and the capacity to rebuild a life anchored in truth, empowerment, and self-respect. Betrayal leaves scars that are both visible and invisible, but confronting it with clarity, preparation, and courage can transform devastation into empowerment. Trust, once broken, requires careful evaluation, and self-worth must never depend solely on the actions of others. Healing is an active process involving reflection, support from trusted individuals, and deliberate steps to reclaim agency and integrity. Ethan's journey shows that even in the deepest hurt, resilience can emerge, allowing one to navigate betrayal, assert accountability, and rebuild a life defined by truth, strength, and personal growth. CTA. Have you ever faced a betrayal that changed your life? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more emotional, gripping stories.